One of the key cornerstone measurements of power in any nation or empire is their ability to project that power. Throughout human history, this has manifested in many ways, but for the UEE of the universe of StarCitizen, the main way it has maintained the peace and ensured their rule has laid at the feet of the Aegis Dynamics Idris Frigate. This compact and dangerous symbol of imperial might has been the first on the scene of every conflict for over 400 years, and its continual evolution has kept it relevant over all that time, becoming more than it was ever meant to be. Come hear the complete history of the Aegis Idris, the freedom-fighting frigate. My name is Paul Shelley, and welcome to The AstroHistorian. This is a channel dedicated to exploring and explaining the lore of sci-fi and space universes and discussing their impact. Today we'll be looking at the universe of StarCitizen and one of the most recognizable and important ships of humanity, the Aegis Dynamics Idris Frigate. Like any good story, we need some context before we start to look at the ship itself, which means we're going to have to go all the way back and talk about the First Tevarin War. Idris IV was the site of one of the largest battles in that war. The planet was taken early in the conflict, and the human population either evacuated or literally fled to the hills. There, a leader emerged amongst the survivors, Rachel Locke. She had no prior military or leadership experience, but she rallied the refugees into a fighting force which became known as the Greys. This was perfect because the Tevarin did not understand the concept of guerrilla warfare, which I know sounds weird, but the Tevarin way of war assumed that a defeated people would be absorbed into the conquering group, effectively gaining the rights and responsibilities of every Tevarin. The idea of a group of defeated civilians, of all people, able to not only refuse to surrender, but actively resist, was literally an alien concept to them. As a result, the Greys were highly effective at disrupting Tevarin war efforts and gathering intelligence from the planet. This proved crucial to the war effort, as Locke and her Greys would uncover very worrying information. The Tevarin began to establish a massive fighter repair facility and shipyard, which serviced and maintained the majority of the Idris system's Talons, the main defense force of the system. These ships were nigh untouchable by the relatively primitive technology of humanity at the time. Not only were they fast and light, but they were able to carry a miniaturized energy shield to make small arms less effective. To put this in perspective, the RSI Perseus, a ship smaller than the modern Aegis Hammerhead gunship, was too small to have an energy shield. So any interceptor craft humanity had designed, like the now infamous Elio Harmon Stiletto Medium Interceptor, was basically useless against the Talon. Thus, the building of logistics hubs to secure their hold on the system was deemed a priority target by UPE forces. Additionally, the Greys reported another unknown facility near the spaceport. This was connected to a vast network of other structures that the Tevarin were building around the globe. Clearly, the Tevarin were doing more than just simply securing the planet, but building up a lasting presence. This news came along with a stabilization of the front lines in the conflict. Though Idris was lost, Farron and Centauri were holding, if barely. Desperate battles like the First Battle of the Argon Chain and the Last Stand of Hester Polaris had managed to be both propaganda victories and halt the momentum of the invading Tevarin. However, they were signaling the start of a much longer and more bloody war of attrition, which High General Trevor Borland knew humanity couldn't afford. In a strategy meeting in late August of 2544, he expressed a desire to, quote, unbalance the Tevarin, to challenge their expectations of how we have been engaging them in warfare, unquote. Over the next week, Borland, High Command, and his advisors sketched out a skeletal framework of what would become known as Operation Nemesis. Operation Nemesis was a daring and divisive plan, Upon entry into Idris, the initial invasion wave of carriers, destroyers, corvettes, and transports were to ignore all Tevaran capital ships and push into the system, attempting to drag the Tevaran into a fight above Idris 4. Specified ships would break off on their way to form a defensive line between the target and the Farron jump point. Army and Marine ships would then invade the planet's surface, seize military control points, and hold until a steady stream of reinforcements could enter the system to back up the defensive line and reconnect to the initial wave who were in orbit besieging the planet. The UPE's Military Research and Development Department had accelerated production of their new R-27HE quote, hull shredder, unquote, torpedoes, and by September 17th had them combat ready for the mission. Naval forces assembled by the Farron jump point, while the Army and Marine ground forces trained relentlessly using the, then untested, planetary invasion techniques. The operation officially launched on September 30th, 2544. In the early hours, the Greys sabotaged many key infrastructure points around the shipyard in anticipation of the invasion. At 1345 Standard Earth time, enemy contact occurred immediately after entering the Idris system. Customized missile ships entered the jump point first, launching a full spread of rockets before the rest of the fleet arrived. The initial wave commenced its push towards Idris 4. The Tevaran capital ships tried to intercept and engage the UPE Navy, but the fleet maintained course and sped towards Idris 4. Finally, once the Army and Marines had deployed to the planet, the Navy turned to fight. The battle above Idris 4 began in earnest as Talons swarmed up from the surface. 3 transports were lost during the descent before the fighting spilled over into the ground. The Army's 112th Infantry Battalion, under Colonel T.O. Koshi, assaulted the shipyard, designated as The Hill, along with Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie mechanized companies on loan from the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Unit as support. After 6 hours of combat, the 112th and the Marines took The Hill. For the moment, it seemed like the operation was going to be a resounding success. Then the moment passed. The Tevaran unleashed a devastating strike against the fleet in orbit above Idris 4. You see, the unknown structures that the Tevaran were building all over the globe turned out to be a prototype planetary defense system. 2 carriers were annihilated in seconds. The remaining UPE ships scattered to avoid the fire from the planet. Even worse, the new hull shredder torpedoes began to fail, either exploding in their tubes or failing to arm when fired. On the surface, the Tevaran forces that had abandoned the hill returned with renewed vigor. Hearing reports from the ships, the 112th realized that they were going to be on their own very soon. Their mechanized escort was already down 50% of their original numbers. The soldiers were nowhere near as familiar with the Tevaran installation as their enemies were, and as a result were having difficulty securing it. The next planetary rotation would last a lifetime. The naval vessels battled wave after wave of Tevaran fighters above Idris 4, refusing to give an inch, knowing that any space lost would certainly consign the troops below to a death sentence. The 112th suffered a devastating loss when a Tevaran Talon strafed the compound, dropping an antimatter bomb that destroyed Colonel Koshi and his command staff. The ground forces became scattered, demoralized, and the Tevaran seemed to pick up on it. The last remnants of the 3rd EU Bravo Company died in the push. The remaining Marines and 112th fell back to their inner defensive position. Major Michael Colleroy of the 12th Battalion, Charlie Company, was trying to orchestrate an extraction plan when an unseen sniper's bullet took his life. His second-in-command, a young, ambitious officer named Captain Ivar Messer, then assumed command of the company. Messer began calling in danger-close bombing runs from the fleet's brand-new Aegis Dynamics Retaliator bombers, while he organized ambush points with the surviving soldiers. These ships were the key to the victory in the war, and it's likely that the invasion was the ship's baptism by fire. Its revolutionary design, which included a lighter frame than most bombers before it, and the inclusion of a Tevaran-derived energy shield, made it more than a match for Talons attempting to intercept the bombers. For hours, the retaliators dumped payload after payload of high explosive ordnance on the converging Ta'Varin forces. Afterwards, Mezer famously recalled the sight of the first wave dropping their ordnance on the advancing Ta'Varin, saying, quote, "I had never seen something as devastating or as beautiful as a fleet of tallies lighting up the Tevs." However, he didn't stop there. Organizing a small recon force led by Marine Sergeant and infiltration expert Adam Kor to destroy the planetary defense system that was still devastating the fleet above. The group commandeered a downed Ta'Varin skiff and slipped past the lines. The infiltration team managed to not only discover the nexus of the planetary defense system, but overtake and assume control of it. They turned the devastating weapon against the massing Ta'Varin fleet, long enough for UPE naval reinforcements to enter the system. The Battle of Idris IV had taken another turn. Over the next few hours, the Ta'Varin forces began to fall back. Unfortunately, Kor and his team had to abandon and detonate the defense system before reinforcements could arrive. As the smoke cleared on Idris IV, over 100 capital ships, thousands of fighters, and 70,000 lives had been lost on both sides. Mezer and his forces still held the hill. His actions had decisively turned the tide of battle. The victory at Idris IV would galvanize the populace in the UPE, drive recruitment rates up, and build on the momentum to push further into the Ta'Varin systems. At the center of all of this, the young, ambitious, now Colonel Ivar Mezer, whose taste for power would begin to push him on a path that would change the course of human history in a very different way. And his personal experience with the Aegis Retaliator formed a bond that would irrevocably tie the ship company with the Mezer family, for good or for ill, and lead to the creation of the Aegis Idris. As Ivar Mezer was catapulted into the ranks for his actions during the invasion of Idris IV, it was clear that humanity had gained the upper hand, and the war would soon end in a UPE victory. As a result, in 2545, the then UPE Weapons Development Bureau, or WEPDEV, started development of a new ship whose purpose was to be a long-range light patrol craft. It was designed for the post-war future of humanity, seeing a need to keep the peace in the quickly expanding territory of humanity post-war. You see, it was clear that a new wave of citizens would emerge from the war thanks to their service to save humanity from the Ta'Varin threat. Those citizens would likely seek to settle down in new lands freed up after the war, thus likely creating several new represented planets and systems for the UPE to patrol and protect. With new technologies like air shields, hull construction techniques, and exotic weaponry, all created for the war effort, WEPDEV wanted a state-of-the-art ship to be the forefront of this new expansion, a first step into modernizing the fleet post-war. They imagined an 85-meter corvette that would dock a pair of light patrol fighters, likely stilettos, to its hull. Their hope was that by building this smaller ship, they could be built in greater numbers than the current ships of the line of the Navy, already stretched thin after the long conflict with the Ta'Varin. The prime contractor role, covering both design and manufacturing for the new ship, was assigned to Aegis Dynamics via no-bid contract, with a number of component and support contracts going to smaller, now defunct, concerns. To outside observers, the result of the ensuing 3 years of development was a model of typical bureaucratic confusion. You see, the namesake Idris that would begin its space trials in 2549 was a completely different beast to the original specification. No longer was it a corvette, but a massive frigate-class spacecraft, massing several times the original proposal. Coming in at a length of 243 meters, a width of 127 meters, and a height of 57.5 meters, this frigate mounted an enormous railgun and carried a fully functional flight deck capable of supporting multiple classes of fighters and bombers. With a maximum crew of 28 and a mass of almost 38,000 metric tons, the Idris was over 8 times the mass of a typical corvette, with almost 4 times the crew. The Idris's move from the proposed corvette to the frigate that was actually constructed was surprisingly painless and seemingly natural for those involved, with the design specifications being revised multiple times as the reality of the post-war empire became increasingly clear, especially with the rise of Ivar Messer to political power. While the full story of Ivar Messer's rise to power is one for a different time, it's important to note that Ivar Messer's relationship with Aegis Dynamics was an important part of both his rise to power as the imperator of the new United Empire of Earth and the development of the Idris. The newly christened Empire's cadre of fresh-faced, Messer-aligned planners quickly identified the project as important to establishing their own power base, and they worked carefully with Aegis and other contractors, particularly AIM Krug, responsible for the railgun installed on the first flight of ships, to expand the scope of design to define a model for the modern warship. Expansion from the original corvette to the frigate was a rare decision that was in the best interests of all persons involved. Highlighting the suggested importance of the project, the first ship was named after the recent victory of Idris IV, already being mythologized as the foundational element of this new empire. The first frigate was commissioned in 2551 in a ceremony at Aegis's newly constructed Idris System Factory complex, possibly even resting on the hill itself. The launch was attended by Imperator Ivar Messer, who presented a famous speech seen today as a prelude to him taking increased control of the UEE in the name of public safety. The initial factory constructed by Aegis to produce the ships included 6 berths that would work around the clock. The first 6 Idrises laid down were all commissioned by May of 2552 and began service tryouts, then extended patrol assignments later that year. This is also where the naming convention of Idrises began, named after systems of the UEE. From the start, the high-tech ships were desired assignments for Navy crewmen, who correctly identified that the then lavish ships would play a major role in coming events. The Idris design became highly influential in all subsequent designs. The first modern capital ship of the UEE Navy, it boasted many designs which have become standard, including its fully functional through-and-through hangar. That hangar's dimensions played a key role in the size requirements for the first modern fighter of the UEE Navy, the legendary Aegis P-5G Gladius, a ship which was almost purpose-built to act as a force multiplier for Idrises in 2589. That ship would go on to influence the design of every aerospace fighter the UEE ever produced, and thus the dimensions of just about every carrier ship in the fleet. When I say the Idris is the first modern ship, I mean it's the first modern ship in the UEE Navy for a reason. Unfortunately, a major delay in production occurred in 2553 following the revelation that there were significant issues with the layout of the original 6 ships that made them particularly prone to fires. Poor placement of firefighting equipment and personnel, combined with limited availability of shipboard retardants, led to several significant fires, culminating the deaths of 17 starmen when one such fire spread to the forward magazine aboard the UES Ashton. Production of additional Idrises were delayed for 18 months while a full review and redesign was conducted, culminating in the launch of the first Flight 2 spacecraft in 2555. With the early issues resolved, Idris production continued at pace, and the powerful frigates quickly became a common sight around the Empire. The last Flight 1, the original UES Idris, was decommissioned in August of 2587, with 43 tours and 9 combat stars. Today, it remains mothballed in dry dock at MacArthur, where it is often discussed as a potential museum piece highlighting the military's role during the Messer era. With what records we have of the Flight 2s, they served with distinction throughout the Second Tevaran War of 2603 and the start of the Vandal incursions in 2681. It also has a less than stellar record of human rights abuses. Being the main patrol frigate of the Navy, Idrises were often the first to arrive at a location of an illegal strike or open rebellion, utilizing their full breadth of weaponry to both psychologically and physically attack many of these groups. An ironic twist for a ship which was named partially for the freedom fighters who opposed similar oppression by the Tevaran so many years before. Still, Even after the fall of the Mezzers in 2792, as a result of the anti-Mezzer revolution, the ship remained in service, still vital to the protection and patrol of the Empire. The average Aegis-class frigate commissioned between 2560 and 2800 had a 30-year operational lifespan. For the first 200 years of production, Idrises were reliably scrapped upon decommissioning, a requirement specified by law for all capital assets by the early UEE government. While Aegis shipbreakers were forbidden from salvaging and reusing systems, they were able to recycle roughly 35% of the scrap tonnage in construction of newly produced frigates. This life cycle was drastically altered in 2801 with the passage of the first Surplus Act that gave the approved civilian organizations the rights to bid on properly demilitarized but still functional spacecraft up to and including destroyer-class vessels. This was done specifically in order to deal with the ramifications of the fall of the Mezzer regime nearly a decade before, and what I've dubbed the cargo crisis of the 29th century. While I have done a standalone video on this, which I'll link in the top right, I will say that this was when most of the civilian shipping construction and operation disappeared due to the aftermath of the revolution. In a desperate act, the new UEE was selling off whatever they could to serve as transports, which included surplus Idris-class ships. This meant the permanent disabling of the keel-mounted gun and removal of all classified subsystems, such as military-spec targeting software. While initially there wasn't much interest in a defanged frigate, within 2 decades the need for larger-scale fighting ships had become greater. The weakened state of the UEE and the ongoing purge of the military of any Mezzer loyalists left many systems to fend for themselves, resulting in a rise in outlaw activity. Suddenly, system security and militia saw the value in the combat-tested design of the Idris to add to their own defense fleets. As a result, Aegis was forced to significantly expand its investment in mining corporations in order to make up for lost scrap resources, as now more ships were going out to the civilian market and not being recycled. Simultaneously, the pressure from those sales led to additional citizen armament laws, which loosened the restrictions on what equipment could be sold off and to whom it could be sold to, gradually going from authorized militia forces to corporate and finally private entities. Some of the first Idrises to be purchased by civilians were 3 frigates called the BX-214, the BX-215, and the BX-218. An aid organization acquired them in 2812 in response to a disaster in the Coral system. Unexpected solar activity had caused massive crop failures in the system over an 18-month stretch of time. The rugged Idris could weather the solar storms, and as such, their flight bays were converted into armored cargo bays for them to deliver aid supplies to the beleaguered people in the system. Another Idris modified by civilians was the Anax. Purchased by a historical salvage company in 2815, the Anax was an early Flight 2 series Idris that was modified with a high-tech sensor package and fleet of drones. Its main purpose was to find long-lost wrecks of historical importance to document and recover them. The Anax and her civilian crew were credited with many major discoveries of lost wrecks. One in particular was a Crusader Industries Genesis Starliner, thought destroyed in an accident. The Anax and her drones discovered the ship intact and were able to recover the vessel. In 2915, a formal information request filed by journalists researching historical spacefaring vessels discovered that the majority of Anax's missions were funded by the UEE for yet-to-be declassified reasons. One of the oddest repurposing of an Idris was Home Force One. A fringe political group claimed ownership of a large asteroid in the Goss system and called themselves the Free Republic of Lamia. The Home Force One was a military surplus Idris that had never had the weapons reinstalled. The Lamians used the unarmed ship in a number of political stunts to promote their cause, but eventually fell into bankruptcy within a year of the ship's purchase, and the ship was eventually scuttled by the advocacy. While civilians began to fall in love with the frigate, the most famous modern Idris was built around this period, the UES Stanton. Sealed in 2872, the ship initially served with the 2nd Fleet, 351st Battle Group, a position it held for the entirety of its normal service life, 60 years. It was during this time that future captain of the ship, one Noah White, had had their first assignment on the ship. In 2935, likely as a result of the extensive refitting to modernize the aging ship, it was reassigned to the 2nd Fleet 87th Battle Group, where it served with distinction during rescue and disaster relief missions in Farron, as well as perimeter sweeps along the Xi'an front. It was during this period, sometime before 2945, when Captain Noah White returned to the ship to take command alongside his executive officer, Sophia Kelly. The ship is important because of it being the main ship we serve on during the events of Squadron 42 in 2946, where the Stanton becomes the home to the player character. But by 2875, the demand for civilianized Idrises, combined with the longer lifespan of the Flight 3s, outstripped the Navy's ability to decommission existing ships. The result is arguably the Flight 4 series of Idrises, also known as the Idris Peacekeeper. This series of Idrises were built with the sole purpose of selling to the civilian market. The Idris P, as has become known, is identical to its military cousin, now known as the Idris M, save for lacking the primary mounted armament. However, as with pretty much every modern Aegis ship, there are aftermarket upgrades that allow the Peacekeeper owners to add weapons to the front of their ships, like the massive Hurston Dynamics Exodus laser beam, which enthusiasts have dubbed the Idris K. Idris Ps are built on request for wealthy citizens, large corporations, and even militias to fulfill a variety of specific purposes. With the passage of the Militia Mobilization Initiative in 2946, in response to the Vanduul attack in the Vega system, Idris Peacekeepers have become even more popular, with more and more groups being able to afford the expensive civilian frigate. One of these groups is known as Helene's Canard, an Idris P made into a luxury yacht by eccentric weapons magnate Jair Forsyth. The businessman has become more reclusive and insulated over time, and on his 75th birthday, he sold all his terrestrial real estate and a significant portion of his weapons investments to buy and convert the Helene's Canard as his mobile home. The details of the ship's crew, or even its whereabouts, remain unknown to this day. Idris-class vessels aren't entirely free of controversy, however. Many Idris Ms have fallen into the hands of organized crime groups like the Arlington Gang, Xenothreat, and the Frontier Fighters, who have used these capital ships to terrorize the people of the Stanton system. Although aging and slowly being phased out of its initial patrol duties in favor of the new RSI Polaris corvette, Aegis has continued to expand the number of available berths at their Idris Fort facility over the centuries, as demand increases from both the military and civilian users. With modern Flight 3s and 4s, the average lifespan of the Idris has doubled to 60 years or more of service, thanks to updated technologies and greatly specialized overhaul process that essentially rebuilds any given ship once over the course of a decade, making modern Idrises to likely remain a common sight anywhere in the Empire. Over 400 years after the ship's launch and 80 years since the creation of the Peacekeeper, the Idris remains an iconic part of the UEE, representing the complicated history of human involvement in space, both a freedom fighter and an oppressor, criminal and law enforcer. Yet still, the ship remains, to many, as a reassuring symbol of peace and prosperity in the UEE, much like the brave resistance fighters, soldiers, and Marines that fought to reclaim the ship's namesake in the fall of 2944. I'd like to thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, think about liking the video, subscribing for more content, and hitting the bell icon to be notified when these release. These take a long time to research and edit, so hitting the like button goes a long way to promoting it to other like-minded lovers of StarCitizen and lore in general. This is my second crack at the story of the Aegis Dynamics Idris. I was inspired to do these new reviews with a much broader look at the history and context of their creation by the works of fellow YouTuber and mercenary professor of mech lore, Tex, over at Black Pants Legion. So expect more deep dives into ships like this video, the Gladiator and the Gladius videos in the future. There are some weird discrepancies with the lore with the Idris that I do want to bring up. The UES Ashton is one of the first Idris classes ever built, but as far as I can tell, there's no star system called the Ashton system. In the future, this might be waved away as the former name of one of the modern systems, retconned, or changed altogether. It's a minor detail, but I know the question will be brought up in the comments, so I figured I'd tackle it. Another weird situation revolving around the names is that there aren't that many known systems in game, and likely Idris-class ships are only named after UE-aligned systems like Stanton. Sorry to all of you who've heard the whispers of the prophet, there likely isn't a UES Pyro, for example. However, it's also likely that there are several hundred, if not thousand, Idris-class ships in service with the UE Navy at any given time, especially over the course of the ship's 400-year service history. I gather they'll do some light retconning to allow some of the Idris classes to be named after towns, cities, and planets in the UEE as well, like a UES Locke, named after the planet of the ship's origin, Idris 4. Personally, I'm looking forward to the ship in the PU and Squadron 42, even though I personally don't own one. So if you or your org do own one, let me know in the comments below if I can get a ride on your Idris to explore it a little bit more when it comes into the game. I'd also like to thank those on screen now for supporting the channel financially. If you want to throw in a few credits, you can toss me a one-time donation on Ko-fi or think about becoming a member on YouTube. If you want a bit more for your contribution, join the Patreon. Patreons get early ad-free access to all videos, including exclusive early access to my long-running complete history of StarCitizen lore series. Check those out now in the top right if you want to know what you're getting. Thanks again for watching, and as always, remember, ex historia ad astra.